Hi, students. It's great to be back with you guys again. I apologize for the delay on getting this lecture recorded. I don't foresee this happening again. So I really appreciate all of your patience and hanging in there with me. Um, for this lecture, module lecture 2, we are going to be going over how we study US Latin American relations. So we'll be discussing theories of international relations as well as delving into the origins of US and Latin American relations. So we're going to start with theories of international relations. Of course, these are realism, liberal institutionalism, and dependency theories. So realist theory of international relations is the theory of international relations upon which Dr. Greg Weeks has based your textbook. And so we're going to take just a minute and I'm going to make sure that you understand what realist theory means and what some of the strengths and weaknesses of this theory are. So the first thing that we need to know about realist theory is that realist theory imagines the state as a unitary and central actor in international relations, meaning that the state is its own entity and it acts as one, and it is the primary vehicle through which international relations take place. The next tenet is that states operate in an anarchic world system, meaning that there's no world government to kind of referee relations between nations. Under realist theory, the state has one central focus, which is to provide security and to protect its own interests using state power. This can be military force, which tends to be the focus of realist theory, but it can also be things such as soft power, like diplomacy or economic diplomacy, economic ties, cultural diplomacy, things of those nature. So security is very subjective. Security can mean all things from securing borders to eliminating insurgencies within a country, to eliminating the potential for foreign adversaries to threaten your country. All right, and then once again, I just want to reiterate that within realist theory, the idea is that it doesn't matter who the president is, it doesn't matter what public opinion is, that the state is going to behave as the state sees fit within international relations, regardless of kind of internal politics. All right. Next is dependency theory. So dependency theory, we'll talk about the origins of this theory in more detail later in the semester, but it's actually a theory that developed within Latin America in the Cold War period. And this theory is that Latin American underdevelopment is the result of structural patterns based on domination by more powerful nations. For Latin America, that's primarily the United States. So dependency theory is great when we talk about these sort of economic relationships where Latin American countries export raw materials, keep very few of the profits, and these multinational corporations are actually benefiting the most from these primary resource exports. But it doesn't do a whole lot to explain the agency of Latin American people or their leaders in trying to counter the domination of Latin American nations by the United States and other powerful nations. So that's something to keep in mind when we're talking about dependency theory. And finally, we have liberal institutionalism. Liberal institutionalism is the belief that nations develop a stake in one another as they interact with each other. So there's a really big emphasis in liberal institutionalism on cooperations through international institutions and bodies. This would include the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, the World Health Organization. Liberal institutionalism has been under debate in the last few years, particularly when we discuss whether or not the United States should be involved in things such as the Paris Climate Accords. So this kind of helps you see where liberal institutionalism is coming into play, and this debate about liberal institutionalism is coming into play in our current political climate. So people who believe in liberal institutionalism envision international institutions as able to influence the policy of powerful member nations, regardless of their power imbalance between the powerful nations and underdeveloped or developing nations. This actually differs very significantly from realist theory. In realist theory, the idea is that these international institutions serve the interests of the nations that are able to influence them the most, so the most powerful. And dependency theory sees this very much in the same way. We'll talk about this more when we get into neoliberal restructuring in the late 20th century, and we talk about financial institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, okay? So now that we have discussed these theories of international relations, I'm going to move on to what chapter 2 in your book covered. We're going to talk about the origins of U.S.-Latin American relations. And I've subtitled this section Security and Expansion because these are the two primary goals of the United States in its international relations at the very beginning of its existence as an independent nation. So the United States is very focused on the threat from Europe. The Europeans are continuing to operate in the Western Hemisphere, and the United States is concerned about these European powers attacking it while it is still very young, weak, and fledgling. So as far as Spain is concerned, the United States is very concerned about how the Spanish Empire in the Americas is beginning to disintegrate. The independence movements are taking off in Latin America. And the United States is worried that one, there will be instability in the region that will affect the United States, and two, that other European powers will seek to recolonize, like the stronger ones, such as England and France, are going to come and try to recolonize these former Spanish colonies that are gaining their independence. As far as France is concerned, the United States is very concerned about the ability, sorry about that, the ability of the French to launch an attack from the Louisiana Territory. The United States also very much wants the Louisiana Territory because it would like to control both banks of the Mississippi River to control merchant traffic, as well as to protect itself against attack. Under Thomas Jefferson in 1803, during the French Revolution, the United States is going to purchase the Louisiana Territory and neutralize this threat. But another problem that France presents for the United States is actually in the Western Hemisphere, and it is the Haitian Revolution. So the Haitian Revolution really impacts the way that the United States views security in the slave-owning South. So the Haitian Revolution is the world's first successful slave revolt. Haiti becomes the first independent nation in Latin America, and Haiti becomes the first Black nation in the world. Many of the planters fled Haiti for the United States, where these Haitian planters discussed all of the atrocities that the rebel armies were committing against the French people, white French people. Of course, without discussing all of the atrocities the French were committing against the Haitians, but that's neither here nor there. The US sees the Haitian Revolution as being a potential security threat for maintaining control over the large enslaved populations in the South. Britain is the largest security threat for the United States. We actually go to war with Britain in the War of 1812. The White House, the Capitol building is burned down. The White House is burned down. The U.S. is also, merchant ships are also facing attack from British ships who are claiming the right to seize cargo and impress American merchants into service for the British Navy. At the same time, these Europeans are engulfed in war on the European continent, and the United States does its best to maintain its neutrality in this wars, to not antagonize any of the powers that are still operating in the Western Hemisphere. And finally, as Latin America is beginning to gain its independence, the United States, despite being a very huge inspiration to many of these Latin American independence leaders, kind of remains on the sidelines, doesn't give outright support to any of these leaders. This is the policy of sort of friendly neutrality. It's an attempt to keep relations with Spain from going off the rails. Another reason that the United States isn't so gung-ho about helping these Latin American independence leaders is because U.S. policymakers don't view the Latin American people as capable of governing themselves. So they believe that Latin America is exceptionally vulnerable to attack and recolonization by European powers. This fear is actually realized over and over for the United States in the early 19th century as European powers frequently invade Latin American nations in order to collect debt. Multiple civil wars in the region, wars between Latin American nations, and then the rise of caudillo strongmen leaders in Latin America just tends to reinforce the U.S. belief that Latin Americans themselves are just incapable of developing stable, functioning democratic governments. So in response to all these fears about the security risk that European powers are presenting to the fledgling United States, President James Monroe announces what becomes known as the Monroe Doctrine in 1823. Declares that the United States will not accept any European intervention in the Western Hemisphere. So it informed Europe that any attack on Latin America would be viewed as an attack on the United States. Of course, the United States is unable to enforce this doctrine as Mexico is invaded over and over by the French, the British, the Spanish, as the British are messing around in Venezuela and in French Guiana. They're just unable to, the United States is just unable to project this power beyond its own borders at this time. Another important factor in the United States early relationships with Latin America, particularly with Mexico, include the idea of manifest destiny. It's the idea that the United States is destined by God to bring civilization to and settlement to the Western Hemisphere. It was such a big part of the American kind of communal psyche at this time. This painting of John Gast is actually a very famous painting that represents this idea. So as you can see in the painting, you have this angelic white person followed by, these settlers with their carts and horses, chasing off these Native Americans who are carrying weapons and, that sort of savage kind of idea. Now, the first encounter that Latin America will have with US manifest destiny is the Texas Revolution. So as part of the push westward, Stephen F. Austin, the man who Austin, Texas is named after, actually got a grant from first the Spanish Crown and then the Mexican government to be able to bring American settlers into Mexico's northern frontier region, which at the time is a state known as Coahuila y Tejas. Now, in the early 19th century, Mexico is embroiled in these civil wars between conservatives and liberals who believe in the ideas of the Enlightenment, and conservatives who would like to maintain a very strong central government with colonial type of privileges and a caste system and all of those things. In the 1830s, a caudillo named Antonio Lopez Santa Anna actually tries to centralize the Mexican government in the middle of these civil wars and moves to enforce Mexican law in Texas. Now, Mexico, one of the biggest problems that the settlers in Texas had with Mexican soldiers coming to enforce Mexican law was that Mexico had abolished slavery in the 1820s, and many of these Texas settlers owned slaves. It's not the only reason, but it was a big part of the reason why the Texans decided to declare independence. And although Mexico briefly won at the Battle of the Alamo, the Texans ended up winning full independence from Mexico in 1836, and they applied to the United States for annexation. Now, Mexico is against annexation, but the issue of Texas annexation becomes a major issue in the 1844 US presidential campaign. So here is where these intermestic or sort of domestic policy concerns that affect foreign policy begin to come into play. So Mexico is opposed to annexation, but popular opinion as a result of the 1844 presidential election shows that the US public was actually in favor of Texas annexation. The South very, very seriously in favor of Texas annexation because they wanted to add another slave state to maintain the balance of power within the Union. As you can see here is a campaign advertisement from after the election that's arguing that James K. Polk actually wins the election and is successful because the Democrats openly supported Texas annexation from the beginning. Now, Texas annexation is going to lead directly to the Mexican-American War. So here at the top in the top picture here on your left, you can see the Mexico annexation. Down in this picture at the bottom, this orange here, where it says Gadsden Purchase, that is a territory that was disputed between the US and the Mexican governments following annexation. The US said it was part of Texas. Mexico said it was not. The US offered to buy the territory. Mexico said no. So James K. Polk sent US troops to this territory, to hold it, to claim it, whatever. Ends up starting a fight with Mexican troops in the area, and that convinces Congress to declare war. It only took a few months for the U.S. Army to march all the way from the border with Texas to Mexico City. So in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, Mexico actually ends up ceding all of this territory in red. So most of the American Southwest comes to us following this war. The U.S. does actually end up purchasing the original disputed land for the price that it promised earlier. So Mexico just kind of didn't get anything out of resisting the U.S. in this instance. Another demonstration of this idea of expansion and manifest destiny were filibusters. So filibusters were individual private citizens, adventurers who would raise their own funds, build their own little small armies, and go try to conquer and annex territory in Latin America for the United States. So probably the most famous is William Walker. Here is a picture of him being executed by Costa Rican firing squad. His story is really interesting. I don't know if any of you know of the podcast Behind the Bastards, but Robert Evans, the host, does a really good I think it's a 2-part episode on William Walker. But William Walker tries to take land in Baja California, Mexico, and fails. He later becomes president of Nicaragua, where he institutes English as the official language, reinstates slavery, which the Nicaraguans had already abolished, and tries to get as many white Americans to move to Nicaragua as possible. He's kicked out, he comes back, and then is assassinated by a squad. But his story is pretty interesting, and these filibusters help demonstrate sort of how deep this idea of manifest destiny was within just individual Americans, right? So that's where we are for our first real lecture on the textbook. Just a brief moment to kind of give you some pointers on this week's activities if you haven't had a chance to complete them so far. So I think your key concept quiz is pretty self-explanatory. I do want to say a few comments about your short answer quiz one. This essay by Joseph is not like many of the others you will read this semester. It is not based on primary source research. It is actually a historiographical essay which critiques existing literature on U.S. Latin American relations. And it introduces a new method with which to study U.S. Latin American relations. So be sure that you can pick out what that new method is, okay? We're going to talk more about it once I've had a chance to get in and grade your short answer quizzes. But make sure you can pick that out. Next, it's a bit dense, this chapter. So I have tried to use language in my questions that mirror the language that Joseph is using in his chapter to help you better locate the sections where the answers are. I'd like for you to avoid simply quoting answers. So please don't just copy and paste from the text and make that an answer. I want to see you analyze the text. I want to see you rephrase it. I want to see you show me that you're understanding the readings. And this may be the hardest quiz of the semester. It's supposed to be hard. It's supposed to be difficult. Do the best that you can. I'm here to help you improve. I'm not here to expect you to be perfect. So thank you all very much for taking the time to review this video. I still need to tell you about your secondary source analysis activity, activity 1. So the objective is to just kind of learn how to speed read academic literature. I don't expect you to actually read through the whole introduction. I kind of want you to go in and pull out just the information that you need to answer the question. Some good tools to use for this are book reviews, which can help summarize main arguments and the contribution of the book, that can help you kind of get that into your head as you're reading through the chapter. And then your introductory chapter should very clearly define what existing literature that the book is addressing. Also, if any of you are having trouble with the biographical information, a really good place is just to search for that is just the author's faculty page wherever they're working. That information is plenty for our purposes. All right. Okay. So now we've gotten through that, and give me just a moment. I wanted to take care of one more thing, show you all one more thing before we go. I want to make sure you can see where your chapters have been assigned. So if you have not already chosen a chapter, you need to do so ASAP. I'm not going to be very accepting if you are just if you like just kind of start your activity on one and then change your mind. I don't want us doing all of that. So if you haven't chosen a chapter, please do. Everyone got the chapter they chose. Some of you seemed not to understand that I have chosen specific chapters from the book. You do not get to just pick any chapter out of the book. You need to focus on the one that I have assigned. And I've been asked how much of reading out of the book someone should do. I mean, you're welcome to read a whole book, but you don't need to go beyond the assigned chapter and then maybe some of the portions of the introduction that I have asked you to look at for certain assignments, okay? I'm going to go ahead and share this Canvas page and show you where you can double check on your assignments and where you can like reach out with other students who are assigned the similar chapter. So here's the Canvas page. You can come over here and click on people. And this will list all of your classmates. At the top, you have this tab for groups. Here are groups. You can either click to see all the names and find yourself that way, or you can type your name in the search names and it will show you which group you are in. Now, when you go to a group, all right. Okay, yeah, so that's what you do there. I'm sorry, I got a little sidetracked there. I don't mean to be so flaky. It's just been a really long day. So thank you all again. If you have any questions, please email me. And I'm gonna kind of just move right along and get your next lecture done so we don't have any of these issues. For those of you who have just joined class, I will make sure some of our early assignments are open for you so that you can get those in and get caught up with us. Okay, thanks a lot. Have a great day.